Roger Waters has created a brooding interpretation of the Floyd classic, replete with jazzy textures and poetry recitations. It's vastly different from the 1973 original, but is it any good? Interestingly, Dark Side of the Moon represents the culmination of the band's more collaborative era, a band that are spookily absent from this version, where there was once graceful intertwining guitar and Rick's gorgeous keyboard parts, not to mention Nick Mason's languid drumming style. Now exists a more sombre platforming of Waters' poetry. I'm not in any way saying it's bad, but this comes from a man, of course, who always wanted to privilege words and lyrics over music. And Waters has made it perfectly clear in terms of his intention for doing this. He says that it is partly a tribute to the original work, but also to readdress the political and emotional message of the whole album. And that he certainly does. It's absolutely unequivocal on this. As I've said, this album lacks those ethereal, soaring guitar parts and elegiac piano pieces. All the oohs and ahs of those soulful singers as well are just absent. But this version is not without its beauty and poignancy, a poetic poignancy, which of course is exactly what Waters is striving for. The album does lack a kind of curiosity and optimism in a way that was certainly apparent there in 1973. And as I said, you strip away those blues-sparked guitar lines and psychedelic classical poise of Wright's playing. We get a much more sombre affair that fits in with the idea of an old man looking back. And Waters has kind of dialed back a little bit on the reclaiming this for himself rhetoric that we got at the start. In fact, he said, "Anyway, although it's my piece, I wrote it. I didn't write every single note. Great Gig in the Sky and the chords for Us and Them are both Rick's and both brilliant. David, Rick and Nick and I share music writing credits throughout the rest of the album. And of course David played the great guitar solos on Money and Time on the original recording. Nicky was, well, Nicky, a truly great and underrated drummer, and more importantly, my friend." He makes a valid point there, Nick Mason being an underrated drummer, which of course he is. He's a fantastic drummer. Wonderful, languid, fluid style that suited the Floyd's music absolutely perfectly. Overall, the tones are deep, rich, sombre. There is a darkening of this piece. The tempos are slowed down. It actually adds another 5 minutes to the running time of this album. And the arrangements include cellos, soft-toned acoustic guitars, as well as the tubercular rasp of Waters as he sings now. Nick Mason has gone on to call this annoyingly brilliant. I think Mason's right, actually. I think this is a remarkable reworking. You just have to kind of divorce yourself from the original to appreciate what is achieved here. And with those opening imperatives, speak to me, breathe, very much establishes the thematic arc of this album very early on. An album that carries the listener along with these big questions that it grapples with, greed, money, class, death. What Waters does is he wrings the more philosophical, poetic aspects of this album, emphasises those aspects, doesn't allow us to become distracted by any of those pesky guitar parts. And Speak to Me, Breathe is no longer, it doesn't feel like a positive affirmation of life. It comes across as a bit of a death rattle, in fact. It starts with him quoting from Obscure by Klaus from 1972, the song Free Fall. It perfectly encapsulates the idea of this life being a brief flicker. It certainly is absence of that swell and clatter of the original, with the verb to breathe somehow transmogrifying horribly into the noun breath, one's dying breath perhaps. Breathe has an almost funereal pulse to it, imbuing it with an irony straight away. If we have to acknowledge one's life, surely we must acknowledge the end of one's life. As I said, the imperatives used in the opening title of this album are supposed to shake us into communication, into feeling, into empathy. Speak to me, breathe. You are alive and you exist. The powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse. On the Run has morphed from that very much piece of electronica we got on the first album, those spectral voices in the background. to a spoken word narrative about a dream, which seems to very much touch upon the fight between good and evil. Time, of course, is the most famous memento mori in rock, undoubtedly. And he pulls away from the clatter and chime of the clocks in favour of a more atmospheric production that puts his hushed vocals at the forefront of it. The only thing we get of the original is the submerged drum beat and the piano that chimes away to Waters' poetry. And eventually we get the lyrics delivered in a much more sombre, slower pace, as if time itself has somehow changed over the last 50 years. Some beautiful Hammond work, some steel pedal guitar squeals that are almost barely audible, but nevertheless they all contribute to the musical palette of this number. It takes some getting used to. Many will find the cud of this album difficult to get their teeth into. Ultimate Classic Rock has written of these new renditions. His former Pink Floyd bandmates imbue it with all the mystery and resignation, providing the interpretive framework that hurtled Waters' narrative towards something beyond righteous anger. With this album, it is just the anger and a sense of resigned disappointment that remains. Breathe Reprise is interesting because we get it has a dramatic swoop of strings and some sound effects there, which all add to the overall mood of it. A dog barking, I think this bird song, all accompanying the beautiful sort of organ throb and scattered drum taps of this piece. Great Gig in the Sky, many of you will argue, is perhaps one of the most transcendent moments on this album. It's almost like a hushed soliloquy to a certain extent, but it's vastly different with Waters' take on it, with Waters delivering the lines with all the solemnity of a priest atoning a mass. In this he recites the correspondence between himself and the assistant of his friend, the poet and essayist Donald Hall. It is profoundly resonant and a befitting tribute, I have to say, and it works quite well within the tonal framework of this album. And of course Torri's remarkable vocal histrionics are gone. I mean, it's replete with woodwind instruments and other things going on there. But nevertheless, it's a rumination on death, which of course is the song's purpose in its original placing on this album. Then we get Money, of course. I've spoken at length about Money. It sounds very different. It's more bluesy, I think, with Waters' vocal resembling Tom Waits to a certain extent. The song is a spoken whisper and the guitar solo is replaced with what seems to be a lengthy poem set amid a metaphorical boxing ring. Of course, the boxer, it becomes analogous with greed, selfishness, capitalism, if you will. It becomes a Rabelaisian figure belching and farting from his corner, a grotesque one that's easily recognisable for the modern world. Us and Them is quite faithfully reproduced, but it lacks the majesty of the original, of course. We lose the sax solo and we do get an interlude, a spoken word interlude about violence. And Any Colour You Like is sparser, with more of Waters' cryptic spoken word pieces. Brain Damage starts with Waters stating, "Why don't you re-record Dark Side?" before descending into depraved laughter and intoning, "He's gone mad." The whole thing is a slower tempo. We lose the choir. It also has some dissonant sounding violins to ramp up what one critic has called the induced anxiety of the piece. And Eclipse has this vocal shadowing effect on it, this female voice, which is quite effective really. But the coup de grace on this is whereas the original ended with that voice, there's no dark side of the moon really. Matter of fact, it's all dark. This version, the reworking of it, ends with Waters saying, "It's not all dark, is it?" So you've been listening to a classic album review. If you've enjoyed this, please share it. Click like, subscribe, and check that notification bell, as it makes all the difference to the YouTube algorithm. Other than that, I'll just leave with my closing salvo, which is I hope you're well, staying safe, and more importantly that you keep listening.